Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about the Moscow Sicilian. I'm going to be presenting 4 games from the white side just to show what kind of game you can expect from the Moscow. And I think that if you're an open Sicilian player, if you play 1e4 and you play the open Sicilian against everything, I think that it's actually very easy to learn the Moscow Sicilian, which is why in this short 2-part series, it's not going to be short, but yeah, because the second video is going to be like more than an hour and a half long, but it's going to cover basically every single or 95% of what you can expect from the variations of the Moscow. So it's quite easy to learn, honestly, and I think that if you're a player that likes a lot of space, there are like good attacking chances in some lines, while there are also a lot of good positional elements, and in general you're going to be rewarded with some extra space. So yeah, let's look at the first game, which is the game played by Motylev against Bauer in this first variation. So after e4, black plays c5, the Sicilian knight f3, d6, we can enter the Moscow with the move bishop e5 check. So what is the point of this move? Now, the point is that this is a bit disruptive because there are 3 moves that we can see that can block. So for example, knight c6 is possible, which is I think the worst of the 3 options. Knight d7 is a much better move, and also the move bishop d7, which is most popular. Now, in this first game, we're going to be looking at the softest of the 3 moves, which is the move knight c6. Now, the problem is that it's entering this pin, which we can actually reach from like the Rossolimo. For example, if black plays knight c6, bishop e5, and then they play d6, we know that d6 is not the best move in this position. And so after d6, bishop e5, and knight c6, the problem is that even though the knight controls the center, like the square in d4, we can eventually play c3 and d4 really quickly. So white castles. And there are some problems here if you develop, for example, knight f6 here, which you can, get hit with e5, d5, knight e5, and there's going to be an eventual bishop c6 followed by rook e1, and what's going to have, what's going to inflict some double pawns, what's going to have, some nice development, and black does not have any compensation for the double pawns. So instead, bishop d7 is best, just parrying the threat. And now white plays the move rook e1. So this is instructive. The point is that the bishop wants to go to f1 in case black plays the move a6. And so we don't really want to give up the bishop, although playing c3 here is possible with the point after a6, bishop takes c6. Bishop takes c6 and pawn to d4. This is, I think, one interesting way to play, sacrificing the e4 pawn, but it doesn't lead to an objective advantage. Instead, rook e1 here with the point that after black plays after knight f6, pawn to c3, preparing d4, black plays a6. The idea is that white gets the square in f1 to go to, where the bishop is very secure here. We don't exactly want to give up the bishop for the knight, and we're ready to play pawn to d4 next. And so here the most common move is for black to play the move bishop g4. Now if black plays the move e5, then they come into some serious problems after pawn to d4. And yeah, the center that black has just built is really becomes a target rather than a strength. So instead of that, bishop g4 is the main move. But now, I think that most people play the move h3 here, which aims for a tiny advantage. For example, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and pawn to g6. And we get this position where, white gets a tiny edge here, white gets the bishop here, but black is quite solid here, and they can continue with queenside play, like rook b8, b5, b4. We get like a close Sicilian position, which I'm not going to recommend. Instead, the most critical move and the best move in this position is pawn to d4, which you might be asking after c takes d4, cd4, why not, the move bishop takes f3 here? Because now we cannot take back with the queen, since our d4 pawn falls. But the point is after g takes f3, our pawns in the center are really powerful, and black isn't in time to actually challenge it. For example, e5, we can play d5, and if the knight goes to d4, we can quickly play bishop e3 and easily win a pawn, or after bishop e7, a better move is even the move f4. And after, let's say, castles, takes, we again can play the move f4, and this results in a big advantage for white. We're going to be talking more details, like for example, this variation in the next video, but that's the gist of it. So bishop takes f3 is the most critical move, but it doesn't really solve black's issues either. So instead in this game, black played the move e5, which allows white to play d5, and black takes the knight on d4, preparing to double the pawn on f3. But white plays the move bishop e3, threatening to take a pawn on d4. And so, which is why black takes on f3 with the knight takes f3, but g takes f3, getting a tempo on the bishop, and the bishop comes back to d7. The point that it's kind of covering some squares on the queen side. On h5, it isn't doing much. But in this position, we can see that it's clear. It may not be clear at first glance, but white does have a big advantage here because of the extra space in the center. And despite the fact that there are double pawns here, white has a lot of play on the queen side. For example, in this position, most people will probably play like a move like knight c3, just developing to the nice c3 square. But in this position, Motylev correctly identified that the move knight d2, preparing knight c4 is the best move, trying to take advantage of the weak queenside squares on b6 and a5. So after knight h5 was played, trying to occupy f4, white plays knight c4, and the knight coming to b6 is really annoying. So black tries to play bishop b5, and the point is after knight b6, they want to trade off the bishops. But after king takes f1 here, the rook simply has no safe place to go, and after rook b8, you still have the move queen a4 check, disrupting black's development. And so g6 was played, trying to give up an exchange, but after queen a4 check, forcing king e7, now white takes on a8, queen takes a8, queen takes a8, and it's clear that white has a winning advantage here. So for example, the game continued rook ac1, preparing rook c7, black played b5, and now white unleashed a very strong attack with bishop g5 check, forcing f6, and now rook c7 check, king e8, and now queen c2. So now the threat is simply rook c8, winning the queen, and there's no good way to stop this. So you could play king d8, but that would be still completely losing. You could simply retreat the bishop back to e3. So instead fg5 was chosen, but after this sequence just winning the queen, the game didn't really last much longer here. b6, rook c1, rook c8, rook b8, which is really nice, and after b4, white played the move rook b7, and the bishop is simply lost, or black is getting mated, and a combination of both actually. So really quick game, I just want to show you some of the main ideas in this 96 variation, where white is known to have an advantage as long as you know some of the critical ideas, and it's maybe the easiest one to tick off the board. I think this variation is basically dead. So let's look at the next move, which is the move in this position after bishop b5, is to play the move bishop d7, which is the most popular move. Now, in this position, there are a lot of moves that can be played. For example, some moves are like a4, pawn to c4, queen e2 is possible. You can take on d7, which is the main move, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. Now, the thing is that in this position, black has two main recaptures. If we look at the main move, queen takes d7, the point is that black wants to play the move knight c6, right? And just to control the center with the knight on c6 there. Meanwhile, if they take with the knight on d7, then the knight is a bit misplaced there. So queen takes d7 is the main move, but now I would like to recommend this position with this variation with pawn to c4. The idea is that with pawn to c4, we're controlling the d5 and b5 squares, and we're setting up this so-called Morozevich bind structure. And so, if we're able to prevent black from breaking with either pawn to b5, for example, black typically tries to play a6 followed by b5, opening up the a file here, or even e6 followed by d5, then in general, they're going to be doing quite okay. But in this position, it's actually important to know that there are some move order things to know. The point is that we don't want to castle early. That's one key important detail. After knight c6, we play the move knight c3. And in case black plays the move g6, we have to play the move pawn to d4 before black plays the move bishop g7 and prevents us from playing d4. So then after this, we play black plays cd4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, attacking the d4 knight, so bishop e3. Black plays the move knight f6, and now they have the threat of knight g4. So in this position, we play f3. And now we get the perfect Morozevich bind structure with this, with this setup, where we get some nice space in the center. Okay, about like move orders, it's actually important here to play knight c3 first, because the point is after knight f6, we should not castle here. We should play d4 immediately, because after c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g6, we can play the move f3 first, preventing knight g4. So after bishop g7, bishop e3, we get the exact same position as we saw before. But if we play the move castles in this position after knight f6, castles, then after g6, let's say pawn to d4, takes, and bishop g7, we can't play f3 in this position to prevent knight g4. For example, if we play bishop e3, then black has the response with knight g4, trying to win our bishop. So that's very nice for black. So instead if we play f3, black instead has the move knight takes e4, winning the pawn because there is a double attack on the knight on d4. So this kind of shows you that we should not castle so early if we're able to play pawn to d4, knight c3, and pawn to d4 early on. Like for example, in this position, g6 was played, and so we play pawn to d4 immediately. C takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, pawn to f3, Now castles, and we get this, you know, the very famous Morozevich bind position. But something important to know is that black has, or both sides have exchanged one pair of light squared bishops, right? Which kind of, you know, in theory it favors black because they've exchanged some pieces in a position where they're, you know, a bit cramped on space. So in theory, this should be good for black. However, it's not that simple. In this position, there are a lot of moves that black can play, and you should study them in great detail, which we are going to cover in the next video. There are moves like rook ac8, rook fc8 is possible, pawn to e6, trying to prepare d5 is possible, rook fd8 is possible, and there are just some like nuances that I think you need to learn with experience. But in this game, the main move a6 was played, and the idea is that black wants to, let's say if we play a move like, you know, queen d2, black can take on d4 and then play the move b5, trying to open up the a file here. And black is accepted to be doing quite well here. So instead of queen d2, I'm going to be recommending this move queen d3, which is the main move, covering the b5 square, so that now black cannot play the move pawn to b5. And we're also defending the c4 pawn. In this position, knight e5 was played, and then white played the move queen e2, you know, still keeping an eye on the c4 pawn. And in this position, rook ac8 is the best move. But yeah, for example, rook ac8, b3, b5, trying to, you know, take advantage of the weak loose knight on c3 here. But white has their smart knight d5 here, which is, I think, gives white a tiny edge. So instead of that, black plays a move e6 here, clearly trying to prepare d5, right? But now white plays, I think, a very clever move. Yeah, the problem with this move e6 is that, yeah, sure, like they are trying to prepare d5, but it can be very weakening as well. White plays the move rook ac1, which is very nice. The point is the rook belongs on c1 and the f rooks belongs on d1, so that it lines against the black queen. And white is also ready to play pawn to b3 and then control the d5 break with rook fd1. And if white is able to do so, then the d6 pawn becomes more of a weakness than a strength. Black plays rook fc8, attacking c4, pawn to b3, pawn to d5, trying to break in the center, but this doesn't work because white has a very nice move, f4. And this, yeah, just even though this allows the move knight eg4, winning, you know, the bishop, the dark square bishop for white, after the move pawn to e5, in general, I love the structure for white because the dark square bishop for black becomes very bad. And even though we give up the, you know, the bishop, which in theory is very good, this extra space I think means a lot more because it contributes to our positional squeeze. So after knight takes e3, queen takes e3, and knight g4, black's idea is that they want to go after queen e2, d takes c4, you know, attacking the knight on d4, so we cannot take this knight. We play rook fd1 now, defending our knight, and there's some possibilities for a discovered attack. So, you know, with knight f5 maybe coming at some point, but first off, they need to deal with the threat on this knight. And so black plays a move h5, white plays h3, knight h6, and now white recaptures on c4 with the pawn. So if you look at this position, it's clear that white has a big advantage here already. Black played the move queen c7 here, you know, attacking the c4 pawn, but now white jumps in with knight e4, threatening to infiltrate on one of the dark squares. Black played rook d8, but now white plays another nice move, pawn to g4, preventing any knight f5 jumps. And after h6 g4, h6 g4, black played rook d7, maybe trying to double up, but now white plays c5, just carving out the d6 square for their own knight. And if we're able to block the d file, then, you know, doubling up the rooks doesn't make a lot of sense, which is why black played the move rook d5, saying that, okay, you know, at least the rook is kind of, you know, putting some pressure on the white position. And now white plays the move g5, forcing the knight to go to f5 here. Actually, after knight f5, the exchange of knights, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, g takes f5. White plays move knight f6 check, and this is very disruptive because, you know, king f8 maybe runs into simple queen d6. I'm sure this is a winning endgame with cd6, or yeah, I'm sure this is winning like completely. And instead, bishop takes f6 was played, but after gf6, the black king is completely open, and it doesn't take long for white to finish this game. Queen d8 was chosen, trying to exchange the queens off and control the d-file, but now queen d6, you know, the endgame is simply lost if you allow the passed pawn on the 6th rank. So rook c8, rook c2, trying to attack the enemy king, king h7, rook h2 check, king g6, now rook g2, a bit of finesse, king h6, and now king h2, which is a very nice move. The point is that in case, you know, black takes on d6 here, cd6, there is no possibility of rook c1. You know, a tiny detail, but also clearing up any possible checks against the king. So now king h5 was played, and now white plays the move rook g7. King h4, trying to escape, but it's clear that this doesn't really work out. White plays king g2, a5 was played, king f3, queen h8, but as soon as the queen leaves the d file, white plays queen d2, and there is no stopping the possibility of checkmate here. So black resigns. A very smooth game, we could say, with just, a couple inaccuracies there with this plan of going pawn to e6 followed by d5 really quickly. It showed you that it's not that easy for black to solve their problems, right? Such that even a super grandmaster like Morozevich was able to face defeat quite easily. Let's look at the next game here. After we get the main position and bishop e5, bishop d7 takes, let's talk a bit about knight takes d7. In this position, we should probably castle, and the point is that we are going to set up either a strong pawn center with c3 and d4, or we can even set up a Morozevich bound with c4 immediately. Let's say after knight gf6, we can play queen e2, defending the e4 pawn, and keeping our rook flexible. So maybe you can even go to d1 if in the future if necessary. And so in this position after e6, it's nice that we can play the move pawn to d4. After takes. We're later going to play pawn to c4 followed by b3, bishop e2, and get a nice position and just get the Morozevich bind again. But instead, if they go for g6, then I think in general, this is one important thing we need to know. In the Moscow variation, if black ever sets up a fianchetto setup, we need to see if white is able to accomplish their plan of c3, d4 in one go. If white is committed with the knight to c3, then it's clear that white cannot play c3 and d4 in one go, right? Which is why g6 is an acceptable setup against white playing an early knight c3. And another acceptable setup is when if black wants to choose like the fianchetto setup, is if white plays a committal move like pawn to d3, which makes their plan of going c3 and d4 one tempo slower. And so in that position, black would also be okay. But in this position, if black plays g6, then after c3, after bishop g7, yeah, the point is we can play pawn to d4. Okay, it's a bit lagging here, but the point is we can play pawn to d4, and we get the nice center, and we have the threat of maybe e5 followed by e6 in the future. So yeah, that's the gist of it. Instead, in this game, again, queen takes d7 was played. Queen takes d7, white plays pawn to c4. Remember, we go with this move order. We don't want to castle early. Knight f6, knight c3, g6, and now we play pawn to d4, cd4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, and now f3. Preparing bishop e3 without allowing knight g4. And now black plays move castles, and white plays bishop e3, very normal, and now knight c6. So we get the main position of the Morozevich bind again, castles, and now a6. So again, we're going to be looking at this move, queen d3 in this position. And yeah, okay, let's look at the move knight e5 again, which is the main move, which is played in this game. Queen e2, rook a c8, pawn to b3, and now pawn to b5. And so I kind of want to show you the illustration of this game, because this is maybe one of the lines that can objectively equalize, but I believe that white has a tiny edge still. And so this has been shown in Grandmaster play, but I do think that I'm perfectly happy recommending this position for the white pieces. After b5, it seems like black is getting everything that they want. They get in the break. They are taking advantage of the weak knight on c3. And so, yeah, it seems like that they're solving their problems. But in this position, we have the response at d5. And we are threatening the move knight b6, winning an exchange, forcing black to take on d5. And after cd5, notice that we actually get a favorable structure, because this pawn on e7 is a backward pawn. It's the base of the pawn chain. And so, sooner or later, black is going to have to play e6 and kind of challenge our center, right? Otherwise, this pawn e7 just becomes a long-term weakness. We can continue with maybe h3, f4, just try to maybe stick a knight on c6 in the future. So instead, e6 is the main move, trying to challenge white center immediately, d6, fe6, and rook a d1, trying to put some pressure on the center. Knight c6 is the best move, but now white has this very nice move, queen f2. The point is that if you trade on d4 twice, the weakness of the d6 pawn is really felt. So this is not really best for black. And so black normally plays rook ft8. And now, seeing that white has kind of set up, a very nice position for the pieces, white frees up some loot for the king with the move h4 and introduces some ideas of possibly h5 next. So black here in correspondence chess has been choosing this move d5, and it has shown to, be close to equality after e takes d5, queen takes d5. But notice still that from a human perspective, long term, it's not hard to see that this pawn on e6 becomes a real weakness and can be a target for our future pieces. So white can play the move knight e2 here, preparing to deliver, reroute the knight to f4, and exchanging the queen for the two rooks here isn't exactly great. Though it is perhaps playable, it's just like worse because white still has two minor pieces and they can still target the black weaknesses. Instead, queen e5 was played, which is, trying to just centralize the queen. Knight g3, preparing knight e4, knight d4, now knight e4. Black usually plays the move knight f5, rook takes e8, trading off a pair of rooks, and now bishop c5. And so I'm just going to stop this game here because it basically shows, in correspondence play, what has been shown to be the best line or one of the best lines in the Moscow. And if you look at the position, like from a human perspective, it's clear that white has a tiny edge at least because of this weakness on e6. White's pieces are quite, are on some quite nice squares. White also has some ideas of maybe pushing the pawn up the board to h5, trying to chip away at this g6 pawn. Rook e1 is next. I'd be perfectly happy to play this position. Is basically what I want to say. So yeah, let's look at the last variation with the move knight d7. Okay, we get the position after bishop e5 and knight d7. Now I think that this is the most combative option, and this is the move that I recommend actually in my coverage of the Moscow Sicilian for black. Although I do talk about all variations for black, knight c6, bishop d7, and knight d7 in my series. But still, knight d7 I think is the most combative because it keeps a lot of pieces on the board. And after c3, which is kind of the old line, the new line here is to play the move pawn to d4, but the point after c to d4 is to recapture with the queen. And saying that it's kind of hard for black to develop with g6, and if you play knight f6, I'm gonna maybe play the move bishop g5 and put some pressure on your position. So that's the idea of it. But instead of that, I would like to recommend this move c3, which I think it's a lot easier to play, and it draws a lot of analogies to the Ruy Lopez, because we see with this move c3, we're actually preparing the immediate d4, right? But also we notice that in the Ruy Lopez, we often play c3 so that we can also push d4, but also give a square for our bishop to retreat back to. Because in case black ever plays e6 followed by b5, we also keep the option open to drop the bishop back, and if it's able to go to c2, it's going to defend the e4 pawn, and white is going to be able to, get some space in the center, which gives them, at least something to play for. After knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, white can play queen e2 here, defending it, pawn to a6, now bishop a4. So it's also possible to play the move bishop d3 here. And for example, there's also this line after knight f6 to play the move bishop d3, which was kind of popular back in 2018 to 2019, I believe. The point is after g6, the bishop comes back to c2, followed by, trying to prepare d4 next. But instead of that, I just want to recommend the move queen e2 because it's very logical. We don't put our bishop back to a kind of odd square, and we are still preparing normal development here. a6 is the best move. After bishop comes back to a4, preparing bishop c2, black plays b5, bishop c2, bishop b7, and now castles, just getting our king to safety. Black normally plays g6, and in this position we could simply play d4. And we see that white builds up a nice center, and black's best move is probably to play the move bishop g7, saying that I don't want to take on d4 because that would allow the knight to come to c3. I think that is black's best option. But instead, black decides to take on d4 now, which gives white the nice center. But the question is if it's actually enough for an advantage. And so in this game by Adams against Dominguez 2012, the game continued bishop g7. And in this position, there's actually an improvement over the game, which kind of shows that there's a lot of nuance in this position. Is that white can play the move a4 here. With the point that I like this move before we play knight c3, because if we play knight c3, we just play in the game, black can often respond to pawn to b4, right? But if we play a4 first, pawn to b4, we don't exactly need to respond to it because our knight is not on c3. And so here, thematic is to play the move a5, just trying to fix the a6 pawn as a weakness we can continue with knight b to d2, knight comes to b3 to defend the a5 pawn, the bishop comes to d3 to attack the a6 pawn, white plays rook e1, bishop d2, eventually, trying to target the b4 pawn, and, black has a lot of weaknesses on the queen side, so we're going to be playing against that mainly. Instead, black can castle here and trying to give up the b5 pawn, saying that if you take on b5, later after the rooks are traded, black can put some, queen takes a8, black can put some pressure on the e4 pawn on the diagonal. So instead, white can play bishop d2, just preventing pawn to b4, rook to c8, attacking the bishop, bishop d3, putting some pressure, b takes a4 is forced, but now white plays the calm move knight c3, just developing, putting some, defending the center, and now rook takes a4 is going to come, and we're going to sooner or later win the a6 pawn with a slight advantage at least. So yeah, that's kind of the variation I recommend, but instead, in this game, knight c3 was played, and the point is after b4, it's a bit of an issue because we don't really want to move the knight back, but we're kind of forced to. And, the play is still complicated. We can still go for the same ideas, but, playing a4 earlier is a bit better. Instead, rook c8 was played. Now pawn to a3, preventing b4. Black castles, rook d1, knight b6, and now bishop d3, trying to put the bishop on a better square, covering the c4 square. If knight c4 happens, then this kind of allows white to play a4. That's the point, that you cannot play b4 because you drop the knight. And so rook e8 was played, and now a4 still. So this is very thematic. As you see, there are a lot of positional as well as attacking elements in the Moscow. And this is one of the positional elements, is that if black plays the space gaining a6 and b5, oftentimes we can try to undermine it on the queen side with the move pawn to a4. So now here black plays b4, but now white plays knight b1, trying to reroute the knight over to the queen side still, a5. But notice that this a5 pawn becomes a weakness, right? So white targets it. Knight b d2, e6, knight b3, forcing the rook to come back to a8. And now white plays the move bishop g5. And the point of bishop g5 is that white is ready to trade off the knight, trade off the bishop for the knight, so that e4 is under less pressure. And if we don't have to worry about the e4 pawn, then it's easier to kind of like target, black's queen side here. So queen d7 was played, but now the point is bishop takes f6, bishop f6, and now bishop b5. Forcing, bishop c6 is forced if you don't want to lose an exchange. So bishop c6, and now there's a beautiful move here that white didn't manage to find, but it's very difficult, knight e5. With the point after d5, you can play d5, unleashing attack on the queen and the bishop. Bishop takes b5, intermezzo, a b5, queen e7, e takes f6, queen takes f6, and now knight takes a5. Just winning a pawn, and it's a clearly winning position here. So that's possible. Instead of bishop takes e5 with d5, black can try to close up the position with d5, but now white gets or carves out the d4 square for the knight. Bishop takes b5, and now knight takes b5. And we have the d6 outpost for our knight in the future. Maybe the black center is under pressure, and a lot of dark square weaknesses on the king side here. Ideas of h4, h5 as well. So white is technically winning here, but said e5 was played, which is also a good move. Bishop g7, e takes d6, and now the problem is that knight takes a4 here would have equalized for black. But yeah, this was not seen. Instead, queen takes d6, knight e5, bishop takes b5, queen takes b5, activating the queen, knight d5, now knight c6, preventing any rook coming to b8. Bishop a6 was played, but this is kind of desperation because white simply wins the a5 pawn and should scoop up the the rest of the game. Knight c6, rook e8, knight e5, bishop f4, queen e2, bishop takes, d takes, queen c2, trying to trade off the queens and get a better endgame. But after we trade this, we play rook d2. White was simply much better here, just up a pawn, and managed to convert this position quite nicely. So yeah, I don't wanna delve too deep into the details of this game, but the point is that we saw that there's a lot of key ideas in the different variations of the Moscow. It depends, if black plays the move bishop d7, if they play knight c6, if they play knight d7. The complications are very different, but there are a lot of themes and a lot of similarities that you can use in your own games. So, for example, in this game, one idea is that if black ever plays a6, b5, you can always think about challenging it with pawn to a4. That's one of the key ideas. And also you need to think about when to set up the Morozevich bind versus when to set up the setup with, with expanding in the center and like trying to play c3 and d4. So yeah, just with experience, I believe that you'll you'll manage to like get these nuances quite easily. It's not too difficult of an opening to learn. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next part, we're going to be looking at the theory section. It's going to be a long video, but it's going to cover a lot of the theoretical ground of the Moscow for white. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye.